This is Angelina Asante, and I'm so glad to introduce long-term friends. This is Jane Wood and Catherine Hall Knight. I'm so glad you ladies are coming on board to talk about your new book. I'm so excited about this collaboration. Now, what is this book about?
Hi, Angelina. It's so much fun to see you again. We go way back, and it's been such a fun collaboration for me with Catherine because we were all very involved with the Florida Authors and Publishers Association. So this is like old home week for us. And in fact, we used Mike Woodcock as our cover designer. So he was a member of the group as well. This book is called Finding Family Treasure. And it's about a class of fifth graders that are researching their family roots, learning some family history, and they discover all kinds of things about their relatives and their ancestors that they had never heard before, because frequently they had never had these conversations with their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, and their uncles. So it's kind of a book about awareness and certainly about connections. As the story unfolds, these kids realize that many of them connected to each other. So we have a genealogist that comes to the class and talks to them. And then the teacher assigns them something about learning more about their families by talking to them. And that's the gist of the story. These kids finding these connections that they have to their families, to the past, and how it all connects to America.
Now, Catherine, I've known you both for a long time. And when I first met you, you were introduced to me as a genealogist. And this is really before all of those home DNA tests became a big thing. So can you kind of give the audience some background into your writing prior to this book?
Sure, Angelina. I actually write under the name of K.I. Knight. There are several Catherine Knights out there, and you kind of have to make yourself, a little different nook there. So I published under K.I. Knight, but yes, I started genealogy. Actually, I like to say I started genealogy about when I was 3 years old. People look at me like, what? Well, when I was 3 years old, my great-grandmother used to take me and we'd picnic in the cemetery, and she would show me all the different ancestors. And through that, I didn't realize it, but she was grooming me to become a genealogist. So 50 years forward, I'm now a genetic genealogist. I'm an investigative genealogist, and it all started really when I was 3 years old, walking in the cemetery with my grandmother. But to bring it to the book, we actually, I find when talking about genealogy with kids, when you can really associate genealogy or their ancestry to a historical event, you can see them like sit up taller in their chair. They just feel more pride, and that pride is connected to America. And that's what, to me, at this time in the world, we need to find that pride. We need to have children associate to America. And how we can do that is through genealogy and through history by connecting events within that history to them. So it's very exciting. We hope this turns into a series, and during that series, we're going to take each one of the students that are in the classroom, and we're going to explore their genealogy. And through exploring that, we're also going to explore history.
Now, Jane, as a former teacher, I have actually read your books, even though they're geared towards children, because one of them what took place in Boston, of course, Massachusetts is my home state. But can you kind of talk about how you made genealogy fun for a school age audience?
Well, it's the same technique I use in all of my books. I have 5 juvenile fiction books. And as a teacher, I understood how important it is and was to get kids reading. And to get them reading, you've got to provide them with material that's fun. It's exciting. It's weird. It's different. They don't want to sit down and read a history textbook with names and dates and places. Same thing with science. So whenever you can take something like genealogy and make it fun, and as Catherine said, relate it back to them on a personal level, all of a sudden history comes alive for them when they discover things about a great grandparent or an uncle or something that somebody in their family did. It does give them a sense of pride. It also makes a very strong connection for them to their ancestors, to their relatives, which at that age, 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade, they've never had before. And also a connection to American history. We really talk about our country being a melting pot. And as they start researching their family roots and their classmates are doing the same thing, it all becomes about connections.
Now, Catherine, in the pre-interview, you said something interesting to me about genome, and I do not know a lot about what you're speaking of. So you threw out a number that was interesting to me about how we're more similar than not, and you said 98%. Can you kind of talk to the audience about that?
Looking at our DNA, there's ancient DNA, there's mitochondrial DNA, there's several different types. There's autosomal, which shows the last 7 generations. But looking at our overall genome, which is our DNA, 98% of it all matches. I match you 98%, I match Jane 98%. That 2% gives us our identity. But the human genome is just that. It makes us all humans. And like I've said many times actually, I don't like to say that there's a African race or an American race or a European race. We are the human race, and that our DNA proves it, because 98% of it we all match. It's just that 2% that may show a different ethnicity, that shows. Particularly, I am blonde hair and have green eyes. I have 32 different ethnicities. You wouldn't know it. I have everything except Eastern China. And you wouldn't know it looking at me. What you see looking at me is the last 2 generations. But before that, all of us, we all meld into one melting pot. We all are related, and we all are related through that human genome as the human race.
So now, Jean, getting back to your education background, with this kind of topic, this is something that's relatively new for kids to be discovering. How are you talking to them about how sometimes history and the patterns of history have not been accurate? Sometimes the things we read and the things that we have heard in the past aren't accurate. How do you kind of relate to, this is fact? Everything you're finding out in DNA is fact. And how are you all relating that to the school books? I know there's something you're very well known in the Florida school system, and I know that there's a certain curriculum that this would go well with.
Well, as educators, of course, we need to use things that are factual. But the best thing we can do with kids is to teach them to do their homework. By homework, I mean do their research. If they're looking at a particular event in history or a particular person, they need to do some research on that, not just one source, but multiple sources, so that they get the full picture. Because we want them to be critical thinkers and not just somebody that swallows something that's being told to them. Teach them how to do the research, and using genealogy as a pathway to research gives them a very good basis of what's real and what's not real and what's factual. So we will always be referring the kids, the students, to going to sources that are good, authentic sources, and that's where they would base their thoughts, their opinions. One of the things we talk about that's important to us with the book is that all that we do with the kids, either the teacher or the genealogist or the parents and the grandparents, is to keep it age appropriate. These are 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. That's our target audience. So you don't want to give them more information that they need or something that's just too difficult or technical to absorb. But with genealogy, there's certain things they can understand easily if you relate it back to events in history and people that they are related to. So it's just a matter of giving these kids enough information and then letting them go do the research on their own.
And you ladies are hoping this is going to prompt the families to get involved, and this will be something for them to do with their family members.
Yes, definitely. Genealogy brings a family together, especially if they do it together, which at this age they will be. So we're excited to see where it leads families.
Now, Catherine, I do have a real specific question for you. Before I hit the record button, you said something interesting to me. You talked about trauma in our DNA. What is going on there? And there's so much division right now in our country. And if you could just speak to that, why people feel sometimes the way they do. And you said there's a real legitimate reason in their DNA. Sometimes people feel a certain way. Can you kind of speak about that?
Yes. I'll tell you a little. I can't tell you go into too in depth because we are working on some clinical trials that are going on right now that will be coming in the future to help all of us. Historical trauma is our DNA holds at least 15 generations of historical trauma. Now you say, what's historical trauma? Well, my grandfather was in the war and his knee, he took a bullet in the knee and his knee had to be amputated. That trauma can be passed down where maybe a great grandchild has problems with her knees because
Wow.
it passes right down, and we are looking at and reconnecting that. What we are doing is we're having the brain acknowledge that this is not our trauma. Yes, it's within our DNA, and that we acknowledge it, but it is not ours. And that actually helps the mRNA, which takes the protein to the area that has the problem in the knee in this case, and it will heal it. Before it was taken an empty protein because it was referring back to the initial trauma. So there is so much trauma within our DNA, which is 15 years. Think of the Native Americans. Think of the Africans that came as slaves on the Middle Passage. All the trauma. You can have an alcoholic grandfather and you have trauma from that. And we react in ways that is historical. If, for instance, I'll give you a real good, for instance, I've had some of this trauma work done on me through DNA as well, and we're looking on me specifically as current day trauma, and we were able to take. I was thoroughly horrified of frogs because as a young child I was traumatized with them by my sister. So we did this type of therapy that's coming, and it actually changed that trauma from a negative to a positive because our bodies deal with negative and positive. So now when I see a tree frog, I want to walk up and pet it. It's a total different. It takes that memory, it takes it and twists it from a negative to a positive. Now I will say we do need to go back and tweak it a little bit because I need to find a more neutral. I don't want to pet every tree frog I walk past. But it's out there and we can change that. It's within our DNA. It passes down to each generation. We are made up of who our parents are and the events, the traumatic events that they feel, see, hear. All of that is passed through DNA. So
that's really interesting you say that because I know a woman who told me her grandson just started playing piano. And she's like, we have no idea. He's totally self-taught. And she speculated it was something in their family where they had a history of piano players. That's really interesting. And when that becomes a movie, please have Keanu Reeves involved in it. That's all I wanted to say. Now, Jean, I know that you can get Florida, at least Florida teachers, probably worldwide, but Florida teachers involved in putting this book in their curriculum. What kind of lessons could they get out of this particular book?
Oh, this is a wonderful story about diversity. We have a few scenes in the book where there's some conflict within some families and then between some of the students. And as they discover their connections, a lot of those incidents, a lot of those problems go away because they realize they're more alike than they are different. And that was part of the big theme of the book. So I would suggest for teachers, and we used quite a few teachers as beta readers before we published the manuscript. And every teacher that read it said, "Oh, I would use this in my classroom," because it brings up situations and themes and topics that might be difficult to otherwise discuss, but you're discussing it through characters in a book. And so that's a lot less threatening. So the book is about diversity, it's about inclusion, it's